Second. And then whenever you're ready, George.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you to those that continue to come to this webinar. I'm really in the middle of deciding whether I'm going to continue doing this next year or not, but and coming up with a schedule of topics. Today's topic might be a bit light. I was hoping there'd be more meat out there to update certain things, but we'll go over a few things and hopefully they'll be very helpful. And certainly we will refocus back on the assessment techniques that I think are most helpful. There was an interesting, and some of you may follow some of this on LinkedIn. There was an interesting discussion from a consultant with one of the largest, if not the largest, ergonomic and occupational safety consulting firms, talking about REBA. And I got curious because I knew I was giving this talk. And so if you are on LinkedIn, I don't know the best way to tell you without focusing too undue attention on it, but Blake McGowan, I think is his name. You might check out those. I added some comments myself, which I may, if time permits, I'll kind of go over and I'll read you what I had said, because it does have relevance to this topic. Although in the content of this topic, I might not actually cover it, so I will kind of return to that. So that actually took a little bit of my time away today in preparing for this. But nonetheless, like I said, we will get back around to risk assessment methods. I'll say this at this point at the beginning. One of the challenges with risk assessment tools to identify the risk of musculoskeletal injuries, whether it be back or upper extremities, one of the big kind of flaws is that up until this time for sure, and I would suspect continuing into the future, most of these tools, I shouldn't say most, I know of no tool that incorporates psychosocial factors. And so there's a couple things that relates to, in my mind, and one of them is, you're not going to get some of the most important aspects of injury risk, and really not just injury risk, but outcome risk. And when I say outcome risk, I mean the outcomes of length of disability and the actual cost of a workers' compensation claim. Both of those things are going to be highly driven, not exclusively by the difficulty of the task for sure, nor by even the seriousness medically of the injury, but instead by the psychosocial factors of the workplace that keep a worker either wanting to go back to work or not wanting to go back to work. And so those drivers of length of disability also drive costs. And there's a few other factors like perspective on recovery and the seriousness medically of a condition, especially when it comes to back pain. This drives the seeking of additional medical care, and it drives the perspective that I can't go back to work until I'm completely healed. So these factors are not measured, and yet they have the biggest impact, in my opinion, on the costs and the length of disability when these injuries occur. So there's a chunk of that, and I couldn't say all that in my response, but I hinted at that a little bit, I think. So we miss that with all of these techniques. And I'll go on because it's fresh in my mind still. So the other part of this that is a challenge is when we look for validation of these different risk assessment techniques or approaches, we inevitably it's really, really hard to get really good validation data. I have one or two studies here that are that I continue to refer to, and I apologize for that because some of you that have attended my sensitivity and specificity, and maybe even other webinars this year, will find these slides familiar that I'm going to review. But they are very important, but the two major studies, one in terms of repetitive motion that was done with 5 or 6 different universities going out into the field and validating what elements of different techniques seem to correlate well to the actual injury rates. Mostly carpal tunnel syndrome was what it was related to, but there's one study there, and then there's one large study that NIOSH and the Ohio State University did, and I'll show you some things from both of those today. But both those big studies, they're hard to do. They're very expensive, and they're very hard to do well. And so the ones that have been done largely have been done on either individual risk factors or techniques that have been around for a while. So you're not going to see validation for a while on some of the newer techniques, which might be better, but we really don't know for sure. So with that said, there's a lot of factors that influence these things, and so we'll kind of dive in here a little bit. Let's see. So today we're doing the updates on back and upper extremity injury trends and risk assessment methods. Again, it's like obviously a year ago that I picked this topic, and so not everything behaves the way that you expect it to or hope to. I'd hope to see a lot more evaluation of risk assessment methods out there, but and we have a couple examples, so we'll look at those. But and then next month we're going to take on a topic. I should start preparing now because this is a topic I haven't tackled in a long time, but just the ergonomics of human error, realities, misconceptions, and how we can use ergonomic interventions to try to reduce that human error. All right, today's overview, and I don't know whether you got the old version or the new version. I hadn't updated the overview, so I apologize if you got the old version or got both versions. But the first kind of point that we'll talk about is how COVID modified the distribution of cases or claims, if you will, by event type or by cause. And so we're going to talk about that. We'll talk about what the trends have been over time. I'll ask really one kind of question. We'll talk about a little bit of research, and then we'll conclude with at least my recommendation, my perspective on tools to use. And before I even get to that, what tools to use, if a tool helps you to improve the workplace so that workers are more comfortable, injured less, stay as productive or get more productive, and it's cost effective for the employer, I'm not going to argue with that. It doesn't matter what you use, in my opinion. If it helps to get to that endpoint, it doesn't really matter whether the research says it's a very valid predictive tool or not. It's getting you where you need to go to a better place. The reason why one of the reasons why I like research, though, is it helps you to allot your resources and your attention to things that have some proven value. So to the degree that science can help, that's why we continue to try to focus on that. So COVID happened, and you can see this in a few different ways. These are now, what you're seeing here is data from the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and these are all injuries. These are all cases, not just cases with days away from work, but all cases. And you can see between 2019 and 2020, by the way, 2021-22 data should have been out by now, but in terms of at least cases with days away from work, but I guess it's being delayed a little bit. It was supposed to come out on the 8th of this month, so usually it does come around early to mid November. And now the BLS is now reporting 2 years at a time. I'm guessing because of resources. So it's they're also reporting things a little differently. It looks like, I'm not sure they're going to continue to report cases with days away from work, but they're going to add those to cases with temporary and something else. Can't remember exactly. So anyway, it might get a little confusing as we try to look beyond these 2020 dates anyway. That said, you can see the total cases reported was more in 2019 and less in 2020. Injuries were less, which is, understandable. Less people actually in the workplace. Maybe I would have expected maybe to see even a more dramatic difference and drop in 2020, but the illnesses largely almost entirely made up, and certainly the increase almost entirely made up, if not completely made up, by COVID cases in the workplace. And you can see this if you look at just the illnesses category and look at it over time. The respiratory illnesses in particular represented a much smaller portion of all illnesses, except for when you get to 2020 and everything explodes in 2020 because of COVID. So this is not a remarkable trend, but it's something that we have to kind of note when we look at the distribution of BLS cases by by cause or type or event category, if you will. The other thing I want to point out here is something that is a really old lesson for me in terms of looking at the categories of injuries and illnesses. The BLS continues. They were going to eliminate these categories, talk of it at least 10 or 20 years ago, but they've maintained these categories of injuries, which are, in a really crude way of thinking, things that happen in a very short, almost instantaneous point of time, and illnesses that transpire over time, although there's there's variation on that definition, even depending on the type of illness you're talking about. The point is illnesses always have been a smaller proportion of cases reported than injuries, and you have to be careful that you, when you look at data, that you're not looking at data within one of these categories, especially the illness category. If somebody had said that 80 or whatever it is, 70% of all illness cases have been COVID related, you might think that COVID cases represented 70% of all cases, but they, are not in that realm. So just a kind of a footnote there to keep watch over categories. It can get very, you have to be very specific. The other big one, and then it accounts for some differences you might see in even my numbers, is whether you're reporting all what they call all ownerships, and ownerships are broken into private industry and various government categories. So if you're looking at private industry, it's not going to be the same numbers as you have for what we would call all ownerships, which would include government reporting as well. So be careful of those categories. It's something I try to teach to my students in the ergonomics classes, because it's so fundamental to not looking like you have egg on your face when you are talking about numbers and somebody says that's not true. So I've been the one saying that's not true, and had some high resistance to some very high profile ergonomists over the years at conferences. Anyway, so looking at a little more of a breakdown here. Now, this is a breakdown by event type. The top line there, all events and exposures, is the total count. So you can see that just like, in contrast, I should say, not just like, but in contrast to the total count of cases, we see that where the total count went down in 2020, the total count of cases with days away from work, the more serious cases, actually went up. And that went up. And I've done a couple things here. I've showed you the actually raw numbers of the counts by categories, but also notice that big jump of really over, or nearly 400,000 in COVID-related cases, or at least cases in this case. That's where the COVID cases would go if you're looking at by event cause, which represents anywhere from a 32 to 36% increase, depending on how the numbers actually would work out. You have some existing exposure to harmful substance cases anyway, but in 2020, the vast majority of those cases were COVID related. And so this is what accounts for the increase in about 300,000 cases of days away from work is attributed to really those COVID cases. There were 100,000 less non-COVID cases in 2020. But when you factor in COVID, you've actually increasing by about 300,000 cases. So we can't ignore this big blip, if you will, in distribution. I mean, you go from, musculoskeletal or overexertion, I should say, injuries accounting for 31% in 2019, and you jump to the major driving category in 2020 is the COVID case. And these are cases with days away from work. So these are the more serious cases. Let's look at some trends now over time and not just look at the specifics here. So if we look at back pain cases, and this is narrowed down to back pain, not all over exertion, but back pain cases with days away from work, we see that, in that 220, the most dramatic thing is you see this dramatic drop. Notice also, though, that even for back pain cases, the median number of days away from work, which has habitually hovered between like 7 and 8 days, in 2020 it jumped up to 10 days. So it's kind of interesting that the environment produced longer disability days, and we could speculate on all the mechanics of that, working at home and whatnot, and prolonging that disability. But it is, noteworthy that it creates quite an anomaly for 2020 and likely 2021 as well, when those data are fully out. But we also have a trend here of the proportion of cases within the, as a percentage of all cases, diminishing. And these are all ownerships, by the way. These are not just private industry. We have this steady decline in the proportion, and there's a number of reasons for that. I've elucidated a number of reasons, or I've discovered a number of reasons for this, including basically shifts that we see over time within going from heavier manufacturing and heavier exposure industries to lighter industries and service industries and whatnot. And so I think that a large portion of this, is not related to, a significantly greater control, although that's part of it, within the workplace of these exposures, but is really more a natural shift in the distribution of work. But and I've written on that kind of thing a long time ago, but haven't published anything on that recently. It kind of takes a lot of work to do the kind of analyses. But suffice it to say that the proportion of cases with days away from work has been declining when it comes to back pain cases. And of course, the bad news is that the length of disability and the costs associated with those cases have not declined, but only increased. Per capita, we spend, more than almost any other developed country on medical. And I'm sure a large portion of it is because of the expensive procedures for musculoskeletal pain. When we look at repetitive motion with days away from work, and these are repetitive motion due to microtasks, is the way the BLS states it. And this has always been, no more than 5 or 6% of all cases reported to the BLS, or cases with days away from work. The big thing to note here is in the blue line, is on the left side y-axis is the magnitude of it. It is a relatively small issue in terms of driving cases with days away from work, and continues to also decline, I would argue, most likely because of also changes and shifts away from these jobs. Now, we might see an upturn as time goes on if we bring back more manufacturing and types of tasks. Maybe some of it is due to increased automation. Again, it's only speculation. The median days away from work really has, even in 2020, maintained a fairly consistent high level of these cases involving, between 20 and 30 days away from work, the median of them. So those are kind of the trends. Let me see. Yeah. So, there's not, there's a few takeaways, nothing too major. When you look at the Liberty Mutual Workplace Safety Index, which this is the most recent one published this year, this was a project I used to manage, and this was a challenging year. My successor actually contacted me to ask me some questions about this as well, because of COVID and how to deal with and handle some of these numbers. But the main thing you see here is you see something that is never on the top 10, which is item number 6 there, exposure to other harmful substances. And as the graphic describes, it includes COVID-19. And, although we saw that days away from work accounted for 50 or 36% of the days away from work in 2020, I guess the good news is that it didn't account for that much of the cost. So we still had overexertion as the number one cost, and we still had falls the same level as the second, and falls to lower level as the third cause. One thing that doesn't show up here every year, and hasn't for a long time, is repetitive motion cases. And so sometimes it pops into the 8th, 9th, or 10th place, depending on the year, but it's not a huge driver of workers' compensation costs, despite it being about 2 or 3% of the total number of days away from work associated with those kinds of claims. I'm curious if there are any questions about any of these data or these trends. Does everything seem to make sense, or what you already knew? Yep, Kathy, you knew that? Okay. Well, at least it makes sense. Thank you, Kathy, for the response. Appreciate that. All right. So moving on here. So I have to ask the question, one of my most reluctant job assignments was to develop a website for our consultants for doing a better job at servicing occupational slips and falls. And I was reluctant because, hey, you know what? Back pain's a big thing for me. I don't, material handling, that's where the money's at, literally. That's what I want to focus on. But it was one of the most, I think, helpful exercises in my career, because even though you might not think of same level slips and falls as an ergonomic topic, earlier this year we had my friend, and I don't know why his name, not Dr. Potvin, but Wayne Maynard. Wayne Maynard was, gave us a guest lecture on slips and falls and whatnot. And it probably should be in the Ergonomics tool bag to be able to navigate through that, because it is such a consistent driver of workers' compensation loss. And I would add even falls from heights is something that we ought to be concerned about. Those are major occupational safety topics, but as ergonomists, we see not just maybe the physical hazards, but also some of the cognitive issues that contribute to slips and falls from height. So I think we might be wise to try to redirect some time and attention toward strengthening our ability to help people in this regard. All right, so a couple studies. Now this one is fairly recent. I tried to find more recent, and there might be out there. It just, my search did not yield more than a couple studies here. Both of them, by the way, on upper extremity exposure, which is arguably maybe not the best place to put your research efforts compared to, say, back or shoulder types of things. But hey, this is this is a high interest topic even still, even though it represents a small and shrinking portion of losses. So in their review, 11 studies were reviewed, and the focus here was on reliability, which reliability is things like, if I conduct this risk assessment, is the score going to be the same as if you conduct it? Or if we conduct it at different times with no conditions changing, will we get the same result? Things like that are reliability. And it goes into a pretty extreme detail on reviewing, the kinds of tools that we're familiar with: RULA, strain index, hand activity level. But I don't mean to discount their findings at all, but they're not looking at validity. Validity is closer to the concept of, does this tool accurately predict whether a task will be associated with injuries or not? And that's really more important than, it's still important to be reliable. You don't want to get a different result because then you can't count on it. But validity is the more important aspect to look at. The author's conclusions: no singular best practice, although they did point out a couple things that I think are important for us to recognize. And again, these things are very consistent with my own personal preference, if you will, or bias, or I'd love to believe it's my personal insight into these things. But the strain index has been heavily researched and consistently has high reliability, especially when used in a team environment. So there's a couple of things from previous research that prompts for me. One is that you're usually better off doing any of these assessment techniques with at least one other person. 3 other people give you the ability to kind of triangulate and take the 2 more common measurements. I'm going to pause just for a second. So I apologize for that pause. I am coordinating getting my daughter her annual checkup, and so I want to make sure that the timing is right, because I'll have to leave right after this webinar. So getting back to this, better with 2 people. The other thing too, and I'll mention this as a footnote here, but there was some really good research on 2 aspects of using repetitive motion tools or upper extremity tools. One of them was, do you get a more predictive result if you use the hand activity TLV? Or I should say, at that point, it was really HAL, and I'll make a distinction in a second of what I mean by the difference between HAL and the hand activity TLV. And the strain index. And of course, there's now the revised strain index, so that complicates things. But both of these conclusions were based on the original HAL and the original strain index. And what the question was, is it better to use them together? And it turns out it is. If they both agree that it's a high-risk task, it's a high-risk task. If they both agree that it's a low-risk task, it's a low-risk task. If they disagree, then it's uncertain, but somewhere in the middle. And so you get a better predictive power if you use both, which is kind of cool. The other thing that they looked at in this study, or these series of studies, was, and this is not the study you're looking at, these are other studies, they looked at what is the best characteristic of a job. Is a time-weighted average give you a more predictive result? Does the worst case task give you the best predictive result? Or does characterizing the entire job as whatever task lasts the longest, what they would consider the typical task? And the answer in this study was the typical task. In other words, what task you're doing the longest. I don't like that result, because to me, it's like links in a chain, and the toughest task should be what characterizes the whole job. Although I would argue, if you're only doing the tough task for a very short time, then maybe then you could argue that there's not enough exposure to cause injury. But anyway, so there's still some controversy in my mind. But if you want the official, most recent research finding, then what you want to use is whatever task they do the longest during the day. Now, that said, I will backtrack a little and say, if they're doing a really tough task for 3.5 hours, and they're doing a very easy task for 4.5 hours, I would kind of think that you ought to do the tough task that's 3.5 hours, even though it's not the longest one. All right, so strain index, highly reliable, especially when used in a team. They also point out, though, Rula and Reba may have acceptable reliability in certain situations. I think they're being nice. However, they are susceptible to differing opinions and interpretations. I would add to that if this is on reliability. If you look at validity, they have not fared well from the very beginning. Rula has not, despite being the most used tool by professional ergonomists. And Reba, it just, there's been some very light validation research, but I am not convinced that it's any better than Rula. So it's very cool, and the color coding of Reba, or the risk coding, I should say, of Reba for different body joint angles is really cool when it's integrated into vision recognition systems that are out there now. That's really cool, but it's not necessarily helpful or predictive of injury, which is the challenge. And here in this review, it's also not entirely reliable in many situations. Okay, so that's one study I came across. Another study that I came across was based on predictiveness of factors, and in this case, it is for carpal tunnel syndrome again, and they had 17 studies. I have not looked at this super close, so there's a little uncertainty with some of these. These are drawn mostly from the abstracts, I'll confess. But it's worth maybe taking a closer look at this paper to find out what they mean. I believe this was done in the Netherlands by authors in the Netherlands, which are generally pretty good scholarly work. So this one, I'd say, get your hands on it if you can, and take a look beyond what I'm going to share with you. But they did find, the typical things of repetition and force. Now, force, they mentioned in the context of the hand activity TLV, which, because this is 2020, I would imagine that some of those studies may have actually used the new version of the hand activity TLV. And let me go back a little bit. So, and most of you probably know this, but the hand activity level, which was called HAL for all the years up until I believe it was 2016 or 17, when they revised it, and they lowered the TLV, used the same scale of 2 factors of force and repetition. But the new one is actually called the hand activity TLV, not HAL. So that's, and they say the hand activity TLV. So I have to look closer, and just didn't have time to get to that detail. But essentially, suffice it to say, that it's force. It looks like they might be indicating the TLV itself, which is a combination of force and repetition, but you still have a high hazard ratio here. They also found that the strain index, and I'm guessing pretty confidently that the strain index they're talking about here is the original strain index and not the revised strain index, is anything greater than a 10 on that score has an increased hazard ratio. They also noted that there were no significant associations in these 17 studies on pinch gripping, hand-eye arm vibration, or force duration. Now, interestingly, forceful duration is part of the revised strain index. They opted for that over the measure of oh gosh, I'm losing the term, sorry. I'll get it. The percent of time spent in forceful exertion. In other words, the percent of time in forceful exertion is known as the duty cycle. That's the term I was trying to think of. The duty cycle was in the original strain index, but they replaced it in the revision with the actual length of duration of the exertion itself, which is also, by the way, embedded in the ACGIH's upper limb localized fatigue TLV. But they, in this review, they didn't actually find that force duration was relevant to predictive of injury risk for carpal tunnel. I do wonder, and I'll wonder it here, and you can look it up if it makes you wonder. But I do wonder if they also evaluated duty cycle, percent of time in forceful duration or forceful exertion. Because that would be interesting, and that would indicate that the revised strain index made a mistake by going to the duration of exertion versus keeping the duty cycle. Okay, so these are two new studies, at least new to me, that pulled together some evidence for repetitive motion and carpal tunnel syndrome. And, I don't think they're inconsistent with what we kind of already know. I believe this study also said that the combination of force and repetition, which was one of the earliest observations in empirical data, increased the risk as well, but I didn't pull out the numbers from the study to give you those. Barbara Silverstein, early on in the days of repetitive motion concerns, showed high odds ratios when there was a combination of both force and repetition, whereas independently they didn't contribute as much. Okay, the other key publication I want to mention is one I had a lot to do with. I commissioned Dr. Potvin to analyze the Liberty Mutual data. I had done this internally for some of the Liberty Mutual data that I had access to, but I wasn't comfortable doing it for all the Liberty Mutual data, so I got basically the best in the world, Dr. Jim Potvin, to analyze all these data, the 7 original studies from 1978, plus the additional 4 that were included in the 1991 publication. And then there were actually 8 additional studies done since that 1991 publication. And the 1991 publication is kind of the most known publication, often called the Snook tables, which is about 20, 30 years worth of research on human capability when it comes to material handling. Obviously, there were a lot of task conditions included, over 400 task conditions, nearly 300 subjects, male and female, industrial workers. It's kind of the gold standard in my and most people's opinion on the capabilities of humans for manual material handling. And so, but there were these very awkward published tables that were used, and certain people had created, software lookup tables to help it look up, and my own company did the same. And that's why I internally, a decade or 2 ago, created equations, at least for the lifting and lowering for females, to make it easier to do some, more quick analysis. Anyway, this study, this project replaced those tables and updated all the data with maximum acceptable weights and forces. So it was a really monumental effort. The CV, I forget, something variation, central variation. Coefficient of variation, I'm sorry. The coefficient of variation allows you to take these maximum acceptable weights and calculate population percentiles, which is what the Liberty Mutual data have always been based on, is you put your task parameters in and you get a population percentile, and if that population percentile falls below the 75th percentile for females, it's considered to be a high-risk task. Past research has shown that it's 3 times more likely to be associated with a back pain claim. So this is an important one. And why do I mention it? Well, because I will talk a little bit about the my opinion anyway of the best tools to use for assessment. And obviously I'm going to be highly biased toward this one being the best tool, but I have some reason to be biased, so I'll show you those things. This study we've seen before. This is a study really trying to justify the use or the revision of HAL, which is now the hand activity level TLV. Basically what they did is they took a look. Let me see if I can pop ahead a little bit. And they took a look and they said, look at the old TLV identifies only out of 186 carpal tunnel cases, it only would have identified 52 of those cases, 11.2, which is, you know, admittedly kind of dismal. It's not really identifying that many cases. If we revise it and lower the TLV, literally lowering the, I don't know whether you can see my cursor or not, lowering the TLV down to where the action limit was, right? So the action limit was here, and then they made the TLV the action limit, and lowering the action limit even further to this line here, to the new dotted line, then we'll capture more of the cases. So, you know, makes kind of some logical sense. If you want to see it graphically, basically, they're saying that the yellow dots were cases that we didn't capture with the old TLV, but if we lower that down, we will capture more cases. Okay, and then between the dotted line and the solid line would be above the action limit, but below the TLV, and then below the dotted line would be below the action limit. So there's some logic, and they argued, look, we will identify more than twice the number of cases that we could prevent. Oh, well, that's a good argument for it being more sensitive to identifying cases. The problem with that is that when you do that, yes, you can increase, but you know, if you really want to do it, if you really want to have a higher percentage of cases identified that are going to cause an injury, what would be the most logical extreme example of doing that? I'll let you answer. And by the way, Michelle, yeah, if you if you go and just type Potvin Liberty Mutual equations or man material handling equations, the whole paper is for free. So we made sure that we made it available to the world at, you know, not having to have a subscription or not having to pay for the article. But okay, so coming back to this other question here, if you wanted to identify all these cases, every dot in here, whether it's red, yellow, or green, is a case, how could you identify all these cases using this chart? How could you actually do it? There is a way you could identify 100% of the cases. No one wants to take a guess? Oh, then I will tell you. The way you can identify 100% of the cases is by lowering the threshold down to a horizontal line at 0, right? then basically you say every task is bad, but that's ridiculous. That's not helpful at all. And the other thing that's missing here is, this distribution of dots to me looks almost random, almost like as random as you can get. Now, if all the dots were concentrated into the upper right-hand corner, or mostly in the upper right-hand corner, I would think, wow, what a great tool. It's kind of defined the toughest tasks are where there's more injuries happening. But there's injuries way below the TLV and below the action limit even. Now, another very compelling argument, if the data were available, and I'm sure the data could be available, is every task in this analysis that they did, in this very large scale analysis of over, I think, 4,000 workers, if I remember right. Is it 4,000? Let me look. Yeah, over 4,000 workers. Then they have, 186 of them had an injury. Well, what about the nearly 4,000 that didn't? Where are they on this chart? And this is what, unfortunately, ergonomic, especially researchers, have done, is they put a priority on sensitivity of a task rather than also looking at the specificity of the test. And it's stupid. It's the wrong thing to do, and yet we keep doing it. So that's one of the things, by the way, that I mentioned in my LinkedIn response to the conversation that was going on. So we have to watch out for this. We have to watch out for this in any tool that we use. Yeah, do we want to identify more potentially high-risk tasks? Yeah, then all we have to do is lower the threshold and we're going to identify more. But is that helpful? And is that what I'd call parsimonious, or is that, a good business practice? It's really not. We want to be able to accurately identify the low-risk tasks as well as the high-risk tasks. Now, I'm a fan of the hand activity TLV, or actually I'm a fan of HAL, because I think now it's become overly conservative or overly liberal in identifying tasks as being high risk. But it's not perfect, and we see that it's not completely tied to just these factors. There's other factors obviously going on that are precipitating these carpal tunnel cases. So we got to watch out. Similarly, with material handling, we have to be careful of this idea of sensitivity and specificity. And here I thought I was going to have a bunch of extra time to finish, and I'm down to 10 minutes. This study, a glorious study, 48 companies, over 350 jobs evaluated, equally, almost perfectly equally divided into jobs that had no injuries. That's at the bottom, the no risk, 0 back pain claims per 200,000 work hours. Medium risk, having between positive number of back pain claims up to 12 and equal to 12 back pain claims per 200,000, and above 12 back pain claims per 200,000. So that's a lot of injuries. That's 12 workers having a claim every year, essentially. 12 workers out of 100 having a claim every year. So that is a good distribution of actual outcomes of injuries. And in this study, they looked at 3 different criteria. The old NIOSH equation, which I just tossed that out right now. They knew they needed to revise that because it wasn't identifying enough high-risk tasks. The 91 revised NIOSH equation, which is the one we all use, and then the 1991 Liberty Mutual tables. First author, Snook, obviously. And what they found, and this is a little confusing, so you can kind of see real quickly in the very top left-hand cell, you have 10%. That's 10% of the high-risk jobs were correctly identified by the NIOSH 81 equation, which is terrible, right? And so they changed it, and then the next column over, the NIOSH 91 equation, they identified 73%. Wonderful. But if you drop down to the percent of correctly identified low risk, and in this case, in this actual study, really they were 0 risk jobs, they only correctly identified 55 of those, meaning that 45% of the jobs that had no injuries associated with them were identified as either medium or high risk. That's not good. That's a lot of jobs being identified as bad that aren't bad. Now, I would argue that the psychophysical of 40% of identifying the high-risk jobs, that's not great, But I would argue that that's realistic. That's probably the best you can do if you're looking at only task factors. Now, the other part of that, and why I like it and still argue for it as the best method, is because it does a good job of identifying low-risk jobs. It has a good specificity of 91% of the low-risk jobs being correctly identified. That means there's not much misclassification going for low-risk jobs. You're not going to be wasting redesign efforts on jobs that are not producing injuries. So that's my argument. And if you look at the numbers, you can't, it's not the average of the percentages above it, by the way. It has to do with the total number of cases and non-cases in each category. But if you look at those numbers that way, it does turn out that the Liberty Mutual psychophysical tables have the best total number of cases correctly, or jobs or tasks, I should say, correctly classified. So to me, this is the clear winner and has some distinct advantages over the Nash equation, because it also can evaluate not just lifting and lowering, but pushing, pulling, and carrying. All right, so I come to the summary. And the summary for upper extremity musculoskeletal disorders goes like this from George Brogmus. RULA, I would say don't use it unless somebody forces you to use it or tells you that, you know, they want RULA done. I have included, no, I shouldn't say that. I've included REBA, not RULA. So I resist it. I teach people to resist it. It just has not panned out for being a valid approach. It's too posture oriented, and it undervalues the components of force and even frequency. So, I'm opposed to it. Strain index, it just seems to keep coming out on top. Now, whether or not that is because for the old one, we're still uncertain. You know, there are people that there's constant, there's a question Michelle is asking, do you know if any researchers are updating NIOSH 91? And there's constant talk of updating it. I'm not sure how beneficial that is to the ergonomics and safety community, because we have the Liberty Mutual equations that are out there. And from what I've heard from Dr. Potvin, they are superior to the previous tables that were published. So, and I totally believe that. Now, that said, there hasn't been validation independently for those Liberty Mutual. They're too new, but we'll come to that in a second. So strain index, I'd say always use it unless you have a big number of tasks that you need to evaluate. And then I would say use the old HAL is what I would recommend. The revised strain index, it might be better, but we just don't know. Oh yeah, and then I said the footnote there, our best time to use is the revised strain index in combination. I didn't think I actually did that. I don't know how that happened. Use it in combination with the hand activity level. Hand activity level, I think, is still good in the original form. I think it's going to have poor specificity if you just lower the TLV like they did. Now, I'm also a big fan of ACGIH's upper limb localized fatigue TLV, but again, we haven't seen independent validation of that. So that may take a while, or it may never come. But I do like the way that that tool is very prescriptive. Now, the psychophysical tables from Liberty Mutual on repetitive motion of the upper extremities, excuse me, is probably not practically useful. But those data are built into the ACGIH's upper limb localized fatigue TLV, thanks to Dr. Jim Potvin, who, in my opinion, is the #1 expert on human capability data for material handling and repetitive motion. What about material handling tools? Well, we have only a few. Now, REBA was designed to, as it says, the rapid entire body assessment to assess the risk to the entire body, back and other limbs, for tasks that are unusual, like home care providers or housekeepers. I just haven't seen the validation of it. There's been a few reviews of validation that are very fuzzy and are not very determinative that it's a beneficial tool or predictive of any particular kind of risk. Liberty Mutual tables, the 91 tables, outstanding validation. The one I would hang my hat on is that study, first author of Maris, the NIOSH, the Ohio State NIOSH study. But I would also say, as I said in the notes here, that you might want to try the equations. They're very easy. The link I'm giving you there, by the way, is not to the paper publication, but is to the Liberty Mutual free calculator that's online. It's an online calculator. You plug in the numbers on the page, and it'll give you the population percentile for males and females. You want to use the females, and it's there for the taking. And I think it's very easy to use. Probably needs to be a 1 instead of a 2 on this scale. And then there's the revised NIOSH lifting equation, which it's the most used material handling tool. It only covers lifting and lowering. I don't think there's any superiority in any way over the Liberty Mutual. As we see, it has very poor specificity, and that's what I would be concerned with in using that, and that's why I advise not to use that. I see one question that I might be able to respond to. Also, poor stratified force above 22 pounds, all lumped together, talking about Reba. Yeah, I mean, I love the coolness of Reba when it comes to an automated tool. I included Reba in the Liberty Mutual tool that now kind of belongs to another company because of nobody wanted to argue that we should keep it, or the Liberty Mutual should keep it. But they use it internally, but it's really cool with, and there's other programs out there that do the motion capture using vision AI techniques. And it's very cool to see, and it probably is very influential for redesigning tasks when you see a lot of body segments that are red. It's motivational to the viewer to say, oh gosh, that's terrible, we got to do something about that. But in terms of its actually predictive power with the scoring, it has not proven to be valid in any way that I know of. So all right, that is my presentation. I hope that's been helpful. And I think I integrated in there my comments on the LinkedIn posting. So if there's any further questions, I'll be happy to answer. Otherwise, thank you, and hopefully we'll see you next month. Thank you, Kathy.